Okay. Be careful what you wish for. All right. I think this one's been a long time coming. I feel what's happened is that people see these kind of animated materials I've built over the years and they get really hung up on them. My hesitation with making the video is this stuff isn't super practical from a real-time application standpoint, right? None of these graphs run in real time. They would take, several seconds to run through once, and you need to do that 30 times a second if you want it in runtime. So these are all just image sequences rendered out of Unreal in this case, right? So you make really fun stuff. It's really cool to learn. You'll learn a lot, and you can make some really interesting stuff. So I think it is worth making. These are still really useful in any kind of offline rendering, or if you're just doing like motion graphics. Like for example, this stuff is drawings I've done, where I've taken them into Designer and animated them using just a graph and rendered out an image sequence out of Player. So you can do that too. Like there's lots of fun stuff you can do for sure. So I think it makes sense to learn it. It is cool and people want it. And people have voted for it on Patreon, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do 3 things today. We're going to talk a lot about time and space is a huge part of the animation part, and sine waves as well, because that's a huge part of what we're going to be doing is manipulating sine waves. So we're going to do that. We're going to that end, make 3 examples. One is a bouncing ball, which is like a classic, totally classic principles of animation, right? When I did animation school, we had to do a lot of that kind of thing. So we're going to do the bouncing ball. We're going to make a clock that actually works, like a minute, hour, and second hand that will tell time if you want it to. And we're also going to make this kind of blowy grass field. I have it here running. So you look at this, like here's an actual full material. It's really simple. This is in Substance Player that we're viewing this animation. You will need that to follow along with the tutorial today. I put in the description how you can get it, the link to go get it. As well, you see it here, just me downloading it. It's not that tricky. But you'll have to go and make sure you have that to be able to make the rest of the tutorial make sense. And you can see even here, right? This is a very simple graph, but it's not in runtime. Like if you look at the seconds climbing up here in the top right, it's not as fast as real time, right? So make of that what you will, right? It is interesting and fun to do though. Today we'll do those 3 examples. On Patreon, I'm going to put up the video where I bring this stuff into Unreal as a material if you're interested. If Unreal kind of runtime application is your end goal here, well, you can go visit Patreon to like get access to that tutorial. We're not going to do it today because I wanted to keep this brief and we're already like, well, I think it's well over an hour, so that doesn't work super well. The other thing we'll have on Patreon is access to the graphs. So you should be able to follow along with the tutorial pretty well today and just see what we did. But if you'd like to like download the graph and look through it and see what I did and see all my notes and stuff like that, you can get them on Patreon if you're interested. But let's get into that first example, and we're going to start with that bouncing ball. So let's get to the graph. All right, so we'll start with our bouncing ball here. As I mentioned, typically this is stuff, a pixel processor would be useful here. You can do more stuff in one place potentially. We're not going to do that because I think we're going to leave the pixel processor for another video, but we can use a tile generator to do a lot of the things that we would be doing in there today just to smooth that over a little. So we're going to create our bouncing ball. We do have to talk about exposing parameters like I mentioned in the intro. So this is probably due for a video of its own at some point, but for here we're just going to have to do a little bit of a crash course in it. Essentially what this means is that any of these parameters you see here on the instance rollouts, on most nodes rather, you can control these, right? So if we scale our circle gets smaller, nothing surprising there. You can, however, decide to expose this to the graph, right? So if you click on the little hamburger menu here, you're going to see expose this new graph input, empty function, constant value. So you can set it, constant value just sets it to a number that never changes. It's not movable. Empty function would just create a new completely empty function graph, which we're going to do later. But you can also expose stuff as a new graph input. So if you click that, it's going to give you a menu to like set a default value for it, what data type it is. In this case, it's not changeable because it wants a float. We can set an identifier and a label for this. So if we just call this circle size. The difference between the identifier and the label is basically what you see here as like the user of Designer, right? You'll see that label. The identifier is underneath the hood, what Designer recognizes this variable as. So you'll need to use that name in certain places. What I usually do is just have the same name really, but the identifier can't have spaces, so it'll put a underscore wherever you want it. And if you hit OK, you'll see the parameter goes blue, which means we can't control it anymore on this node, right? It's not accessible here anymore because it's been promoted to the parent. So if you now click anywhere on the empty graph and scroll down to the input parameters here, you'll see this is where this lives now, right? This is that parameter we just exposed. So if I click on him here, it is now movable here. And what's fun with that is we can do all sorts of interesting stuff. If we have a new graph, we'll call this like exporter or something. If we were to drag that previous graph into this one, this is usable on the exported version of that graph, right? This substance graph that's nested in here. So we'll just name this something quickly because we're going to call this bouncing ball generator. And I'll just plug this directly into the output for a second. You'll see that in the exporter graph, we have control of that in another graph, right? So it's really useful for all sorts of stuff. We're going to need it today for a bunch of stuff. So go back into the bouncing ball generator quick. And we're not really going to need this for now, so we can just reset this and delete it as an instance parameter because we don't actually need it. What we are going to do is create our bouncing ball. Like I mentioned in the intro video too, we're going to be using player, so you have to install that to be able to actually view the animation. But what we'll do first is I'm going to set this tile generator to 1 by 1. So it's just going to generate a single circle, and we're going to essentially use this tile generator to move the ball left and right, up and down, stretch and squash it. We're going to do that all on this tile generator, which, like I said, pixel processor would be helpful. This topic for another video. The first thing I want to do is you'll notice that if I scale this down or move it, it's scaling towards the center of the image. Because we're going to have the ball bouncing off the ground, the classic look, I want it to hit the ground and then squash down to meet the ground. So I actually don't want it to scale towards the bottom of the image. I want it to, or towards the middle of the image rather. I want it to scale towards the bottom. So we're going to create another tile generator first for our disk here. And I'm going to scale this down by half and then offset it in Y so that you need 0.75 here or 0.25. So that it starts, you can see if we put a transform here, the center of the image is the bottom of the ball. So this is where it will rotate from, right? So we plug that into the tile generator instead. We don't need the transform. If we rotate this now in the second tile generator, you'll see it like rotates from the center, which is really nice because it's just rotating the image or the UV space from the middle. And if we decide to scale this down, it's going to scale towards the middle, which will be really helpful later. You can see the difference, right? If we had this and we try to move this or scale it, it's just going towards the middle. So this is sort of just a thing we need to do first to set up what it is we're trying to do. And then on this tile generator is where I'm going to set up the bouncing ball. So I'm going to move this so it basically touches the bottom. So we're going to have them bounce off the bottom of the ground. We know 0.5 is exactly the value we need. And we'll plug this in. Actually, I don't want to have just a disk. Let's have like an actual, basically a sphere. So I have like a parabola. And I might just level this a bit so it's a bit more round. This is just a visual thing. It won't change if this works or not. But just to make it look a little neater. Cool. So there's our first ball. And we want this. We're going to do this. We're going to do the side to side motion at some point. But first, it's probably better to do the up and down. Let's just deal with the bounce first, and then we'll add the side to side motion and then the stretch and squash. So here, we know what we need to move. We need this value to move. We basically want it to go from 0.5. And let's just duplicate this for a sec to see what value we need. So we can kind of visualize what value we need to move it. Right, it's going to be minus 0.3. So that's at the top. We need this to go from 0.5 to minus 0.3. That would make the ball go from the bottom of the UV sheet all the way to the top without looping around. So we'll keep that for now, but let's just get this ball moving in the first place. The way we're going to do that is we know we're going to need to use this global offset to move the ball just generally. So we're going to go here. Something to note about this parameter is it's a float 2, right? There's 2 values here. unlike when we were doing the scale of the circle, this is just a single float. It's a number that just can be anywhere between, you know, negative a million and positive a million, right? It can just be whatever you want. On the tile generator size and offset, this is two numbers, an X value and a Y value, or a U and a V value, right? If you're dealing with UVs, which we are essentially. So the question becomes, this is going to be slightly different in here. We're not going to expose this time. We're going to create an empty function. So create that. It totally empties it out, and now we're in the function graph here. So you'll see at the top we have our bouncing ball generator graph and the global offset graph. You can click on this little graph button here to jump into it. And this is just an empty graph full of new stuff, right? So if you've never had any experience with this, like, it'll be kind of new and maybe a little scary. If you've built like shaders before, there's some of this stuff will be very, very familiar. It's just different data types: floats, float twos, float threes, float fours, integers, booleans, multiply, add, like a bunch of your math nodes. It's all it really is, right? This is sort of not quite the DNA of Substance Designer, but sort of its, you know, like blood and bones, I suppose, right? So we could just go, hey, let's make two floats, right? So these are just single numbers. And you can see down on the grayscale, or down here, this little gray text says the expected output type is a float 2. So these are float 1s. Like, all the different data types have different colors for their noodles. Right, so there's a float 2, which is what we need. There's a float 3, so on and so forth, right? They have different colors. So we know we need a float 2. You don't specify, like, you don't have an output node in here like you would in a normal graph. Instead, you just right click on whatever node you want to be the output node and hit set as output. And it'll go orange like this. So now that this is orange, this is our global offset, right? The values that are plugged into this float 2, essentially. So we don't want to have to go in here and change these to move it, because this isn't really helpful, right? This is actually one step more complicated than just having it on the tile generator. It's not terribly useful. But instead what we can do is we'll hop out to our main graph, and in the input parameters, we're actually just going to build one first. So we're going to add a new float, and we'll call this ball height. That'll be both the identifier and the label. You'll see me do this a lot. The same name for both. This is a float. We'll start it at 0. And now if we go back into the tile generator's offset, what's fun is in here we can get a float. So this is going to allow us to reference a float we have elsewhere. So if I hit get float on this list up here, we have any other float. This time variable is going to be really important later. We'll need this for all of our animation. It's basically how it just works at all. But for now, we're going to use the ball height. And we need a float 2 as our output. 2 numbers. So we can't make this the output, right? Because this is just one number. This is just, for us, going to be the height. This is the horizontal movement, right? The X movement. This is the Y movement. We have to combine these into a float 2. So the way you do that is with a vector float 2. So this allows you to plug in 2 and turn them into a higher order number, right? So now these are 2 numbers appended to each other as opposed to 2 separate numbers. So we can right click on this and set that as the output. The order of these matter, right? Because the U comes first. The X number, right? The horizontal offset comes before the vertical offset. So that's why you have to go in this order. If you went like this, ball height would be controlling the left and right movement, not the height. So the order of these inputs does matter. Put these here. And now if we go out here and the main graph and double click anywhere out here, or click on the graph, either way, over on the input parameters, our ball height does control the height of the ball, right? So at this point, let's just put this into Substance Player just to see what happens, right? So you'll have player up. The way you have to put the graph into here is actually as a Substance archive, not as a graph. So if we go into Designer, you're going to right click on this and go Publish SBSAR. All the compression stuff like that is totally fine, doesn't really matter. You're going to publish this to some folder. I have it in our little instructional thing here. I've already exported it, so it's asking me if I want to republish it, which is fine. And then in player, you'll go to open and open that location and open up the SBSAR, the substance archive you exported, not the graph. And this will pull it in. Now, we don't have anything in here. We have to go to our bouncing ball generator. We do have all the parameters we ordinarily would have. The reason why this here is because we have two graphs, right? The exporter we built, which we're probably going to delete actually, because we don't really need for now. So let's actually delete this. And you're going to see me do this a lot. Republish the SBSAR file. So that just quickly re-exports it. And then in a player, you can hit auto reload or reload, right? So like if I go to auto reload, this will just update whenever that archive updates, which is nice. So now we don't have that. We only have one graph in here, the bouncing ball generator. And I can just move this. Now this isn't animation, right? This is not automated. This is me just moving this slider around, which is not terribly helpful. This is where that time variable comes in, because time is just a float, a single number like this, that just starts at 0 and just continues to climb at a speed we're going to specify. It'll just keep going up and up and up. So that's what we're most interested in using for actually animation. The time variable is necessary. In fact, that's the only reason we're using player, is we need something to drive those values up and down or whatever we want to do with them. And the time variable isn't, we have no timeline in Designer with which to preview that. So that's what player is being used for. So if we go into the tile generator, we're going to actually take a bunch of these instance parameter rollouts down so we don't have to zoom so much. We only really need position right now. So we don't have to sort through them all. You go to position. Instead of using that slider we built to control the ball height, we're going to get a float again. And this time we're going to pick time. So this is, that $sign means it's a system variable. So this is just this is in all Designer graphs you make. It's not just the current one you're working on. It'll be accessible in any of them. So you put that here instead. Now we can't preview this in Designer. There's no way to see this. But if we republish this archive, right? So I just right click, republish, refresh this, you'll see that in player now we have this, I'm hiding it probably. So move me for a sec. Let's move me. There you go. We have a timeline here now. This timeline didn't exist until the graph we imported had a time variable somewhere in the graph connected to an output. And what's cool now is if you hit play, it actually moves, right? We see the timeline go up at the bottom, and this continues to just move, which is really cool. There's two different play buttons here. The front one plays it at real time. So it just says, hey, I'm going to play regardless of how slow the graph is, essentially, right? The right one, this red one, is going to play, but it's going to make it be real time at the expense of dropping frames. So even if the graph is too slow to show you every frame, it's just going to show you as many as it can to keep it feeling the actual speed it ought to be. So you'll see me often hit this. It's not that different now because this is a very cheap graph, but once you start getting more complicated, you'll probably be relying more on this red button to be able to see it, even if it's going to feel kind of stuttery, laggy. You're at 800, 900 ping and you see stuff just jump around. That will happen, but it gives you a more realistic expectation around the speed of the graph. Eventually playing it at the normal play real time, all frames using the current frames per second, is going to get a little slow. But this is cool and it works well. You can see there's the value of time here ascending in the right. So this number just continues to just go up. If we want to change the speed of that, we need to make another variable. So we'll go back to our input parameters of the graph. And again, you access that by clicking anywhere in the empty graph or on the name of the graph here. Go down to input parameters. We're going to create another one. And we'll call this one anim speed. We're going to go back into our tile generator's global offset. So instead of going down here and clicking on the graph button, it is available up here on the graph tab because we had just been in there recently. So we click on this. To slow down or speed up time, we just need to multiply it. So if we multiply this and I get a float and we find our anim speed, the way to think about this is if we set our anim speed to 0 and we're multiplying time by 0, then it doesn't matter what number this time value is. It's going to be 0, right? If we multiply time to 0, it can't climb because even if the value is 100, it becomes 0. If it's 50, it becomes 0. If it's 3 trillion, it becomes 0. There's nothing you can do about it. But if we have the anim speed at something like, let's say 0.5, then when the time should be 1, it'll instead be 0.5. When it should be 2, it should be 1. When it should be 10, it'll be 5. So it's slowing down the speed of time. And the same is true in reverse. You can multiply this and make it much faster. So I'll go in here and let's set the anim speed default to just 1 for now. And I'm going to republish this. And we'll open up player. And just force that reimport. If we play this, right, we're still moving. But we now can change the speed here. So if we set our anim speed to like 2, it'll be twice as fast. Right, moving a lot quicker. We can set it to much slower. Or we set to like 0.25 or something. Now it's going to move way slower. So that's like, honestly, that's like most of what you need to know is slowing up and speeding down time. That's how you do a lot of animation. Really, it's like kind of a core principle of it. It's just like the speed of different things. So that gets a lot done. Obviously, our bouncing ball doesn't make any sense because right now it is just a forever infinitely falling ball. We want it to, instead of going constantly, the reason we see it constantly is because once it leaves the bottom of the frame, it's coming in the top of the frame again, right? It's just cycling through. We want it to actually just bounce between the top and the bottom. And that's where we have to start talking about sine waves. So this will be important for a lot of animation stuff you're going to do as well. You're going to run into this all the time. So I built a little demonstration here just to show you what a sine wave is. So this is a sine wave. So you can think about time as the position along this curve, because we're going to plug the time variable into a sine wave, right? So if we go into the tile generator and go back to its global offset, we're going to go plug this into sine, right? The time value is just asking for a position along that curve. So if we go look at our example here, let's say at time 0, the value on this curve is -1. And then as the time value goes up to like 1, it'll be -0.5. Then when the time value is 3, it'll be 0. And at 4, it'll be +0.5. And at 5, it'll be +1. And it's just going to keep bouncing between -1 and 1, right? The sine wave is really important. You see this a lot in nature, right? Like it's bouncing between -1 and +1. But importantly, as a default, it will do that. But importantly, like it slows up or slows down and speeds up in and out of the curves, right? So it's fastest in the middle. This is where the value changes really rapidly, but then it slows down at the top, speeds up. It's like a roller coaster, right? Slows down at the bottom, speeds up. A lot of things do this, right? There's a pendulum swinging back and forth on a clock, right? It'll just gets slower, goes faster through the swing, slows down again. Like your lungs do this when you're breathing. As you breathe in, like it's faster through the breath, and you see it kind of pause and slow, and then it speeds up again until the bottom of your breath. Lots of things do this, so it's really useful for animation. Well, it's useful for all sorts of stuff, just textures as well. This is useful all over the place. So we're going to take this and have it bounce around to provide the height of our ball bouncing, right? So we're going to go into the tile generator here, go to our global offset, and this sine wave, we're going to use it as a lerp So this is a linear interpolation. So this is the exact same thing. Actually, is using a blend mode in Designer set to copy, right? Where you have, let's say, a value of red in the foreground and a value, can't copy today, a value of green in the background. If you have this set on copy, this is a linear interpolation. At 0, it's going to give you whatever's in the background. At 1, it's going to give you whatever's in the foreground, and like some mix of the two at 0.5, right? Exactly between them. So we get this kind of like desaturated or a very dark yellow, right? Because it's half luminance of both red and green. So this is a linear interpolation, essentially. Not essentially, it is really. So we want to pick our two heights, the bottom height and the top height, and have it just cycle between those two. So I know we had them earlier and I've forgotten what they are, but it's 0.5 and something. So I'm going to duplicate this for a second and reset this. And we'll just find what our maximum and minimum heights are. So the minimum height is 0.5. So we can make a little cage here if we want, just so we know where these, if cage is the wrong word, but a little frame here. I almost wrote cage. We'll call this heights. Right, so here's the minimum height. Value should be 0.5. And then the maximum height, it was like negative 0.2, negative 0.3. Right, so that's as tall as it should go, negative 3. And it should go as low as 0.5. Right, bouncing back and forth between those. So in our global offset for the ball, we're going to make those values. Right, so 0.5. And we'll get another float, and we'll call this one negative 0.3. And we just need, right, so I'm going to make a temporary float called debug, which we will get rid of, but just to show you. This one isn't that important. I'm just using it to prove a concept here. I'm going to get a float and call it debug. And this is going to go into the X, right? What's the equivalent, almost like the alpha of the blend node into the linear interpolation. And I'll use that as our vertical number. And the reason I'm doing that is just so you can see in here that as I move between 0 and 1 in the debug value, we just bounce between those two numbers. And this can keep going up, right? And go past the lerp. But like we saw in our sine wave, it's just going to bounce between 0 and 1, right? In and out. Breathe in, breathe out. Shore water comes into the shore, in and out. Pendulum swinging, all sorts of stuff. So we're just going to bounce between 0 and 1 here, our minimum and our maximum height. An issue with using the sine wave like this right away is that we're not actually going to bounce between 0 and 1 right now. We're going to bounce between negative 1 and 1, which when we plug it into a lerp in this case, we're not exactly stoked about. So let's give it a shot here and we'll see how this looks. So we won't use the debug anymore. We're going to use the output of our sine wave to bounce between those two values. Like this. So let's publish this and open up player, and we'll go look at how this works. See how it goes way off the top? So it bounces off the bottom, but then leaves, it returns to his home planet. His planet needs him. Right? So it's going much further than we'd like. It's not actually stopping at that top, right? It's going much, much further and coming in through the bottom again. And the reason for that is because that sine wave isn't going from 0 to 1. It's going from -1 to 1. So we need to change this wave so that it actually just vacillates from 0 to 1, right? So what we do here is we have to do some math to this sine wave to make it move to the number we want. What we're going to do is multiply this by half, right? So this entire range is going to be squished down by half. So we can preview this here. And this part's unimportant. You can play with it. If you get the graph on Patreon, right, you can open this stuff up and play with it. But for now, what's important to know is I'm going to cut this in half. Right, so I'm going to make it so that instead of going from -1 to +1, we multiply it by half. It'll go from -0.5 to +0.5. And then all we do is add 0.5 again. Because if we add 0.5 to this, we shift the whole thing up. Now we're doing the exact same wave, but instead of going from -1 to +1, we're going from just 0 to +1. Right? So that thing in 2 steps. The first thing we're going to do is multiply everything by 0.5. And then we're going to add 0.5 to remap where that sine wave is happening. So if we do that in here, go to our tile generator, we can just do this right here. So the first thing we're going to do is multiply by 0.5. So this is just a float. And then we'll add. There also is a sign that I believe is mapped to 0. There's also a -1 to 1 to 0 to 1 node that will do this for you, but that's all it is. So just so you understand what's going on in here, like you can just use this if you'd like, but we're gonna have to make some adjustments to it anyway. So we save this, republish it. This will work a lot more like expected now. We are just gonna bounce from the bottom and the top. It's way better. It's a little slow. So we probably want, you know, this speed, anim speed variable will have to go up quite a bit, not 5,000. Well, let's see what it looks like. Yep. He's freaking out, man. So we'll make this more like 5 or 10 or something. Cool. So remapping that sine wave is a very important component of how this works, right? That's something you're going to have to rely on a lot. Of note, with the bouncing balls we have it right now, it doesn't make a ton of sense because right now it makes sense at the top because it slows down. Like if you go do it right now, if you have a ball, throw it. I have a bunch in here actually for the dog, but if you drop a ball, it bounces off the ground, but once it's at the top of its arc, it slows down because gravity starts catching up to it and starts pulling it back down to earth, right? But off the bottom, when it bounces off the bottom, it doesn't hang there like it is now, right? Right now it's kind of like slowly floating off the bottom. We want it to like skip right off the bottom. It should touch it for like a second, and then it shouldn't. There's no reason for it to slow down in anticipation of hitting the ground, right? Which is what it's doing right now. You can see as it's getting closer to the base, it slows down, sort of like a yo-yo almost right now, right? We want it to skip off. The reason why it's not looking that right now is because of the shape of this sine wave, right? If you go back and preview this down in the wave here, imagine this as the height of the ball because it is literally what we're doing, right? It's slowing down before it hits the ground, and then it's staying there for a sec, and then it's speeding up and then slowing down at the top. This part works, but we kind of prefer this to be a straight line, right? What we would prefer this to look like is something like this, where this just bounces. Imagine this is very much the path of a bouncing ball, right? It just skips. Right? Imagine if you like dropped a ball on the ground and you like charted its height. It should look like this. I mean, the bounces should get slower with time, or shorter with time as it loses energy, right? But this feels much better. So this is a slightly different way to think about it. What we want to do really, it's a little bit different from the remapping we did previously, right? We just did it this way. What we would prefer, I'm going to return that math so it's back to the -1 to 1. What we wanted to do here is, this is fine. All the part above 0 makes perfect sense. But we just don't like all the stuff below 0. What we would prefer is that once this number turns negative, instead of being negative, just be positive. So imagine this line, but flipped mirrored vertically across the 0 axis here, so that it would just, instead of continuing down, it just bounces back up, which is what this is, right? This wave is that. We have an ability to do that really easily. If you go into the tile generator for our animation and our offset, we're going to actually not need this remapping we did. We'll use this later for sure. But what we want to do here is this node called absolute. So this returns like the unsigned value of this. Basically is just going to say, hey, if you're negative, instead of being negative, be positive. Right? So it's a good life lesson, I suppose, right? Whenever the number goes negative here, instead, it'll just drop that negative and be positive instead. And that will have the exact effect of mirroring vertically that sine wave across here. Because originally, this value at some point just goes negative. But imagine if these numbers were all positive. Right? Instead of this continuing to go down below 0, it'll just skip right back up. So this is going to give us the exact behavior we're looking for in terms of the bouncing ball. So if we republish this, open up player and refresh this, this will make a lot more sense. Oops. I don't think we must not have plugged everything in correctly, if I had to guess. Here. Nope, that should be fine. That's right. Oh, you know what it is? That's funny. So we'll republish this. Just make sure it's reset. What's happening here? It's bouncing off the top. So I just have the numbers on the lerp put in backwards, right? It's bouncing off the top of the ceiling, I suppose, in our example here, not the floor. So that's a really easy fix. We'll just go into designer here and just these numbers I had in the wrong order. Like that. And now if we refresh this, this will work properly. So republish this, go into player, make sure you can hit that refresh button. It doesn't appear like that auto reload is working great. But here you go. Now we have a bouncing ball, right? It actually skips off that bottom because it only stays there for just like a brief second, right? So that works well. Much, much better. So this will be like a lot more effective for just creating that look, right? And we can turn the speed up. If we don't want to have to keep manually changing this speed in here, what we ought to do is open up designer again, go to that speed variable, and set its default to be, 3 or 4, whatever it is. We'll set to 3. And that way, when we republish this and bring it into player, it'll automatically be 3, right? We don't have to change it every time. That's just the default. Well, there's our bouncing ball really simply. There's some stuff we can do to improve this. For one thing, we want to do some stretch and squash, right? So it should actually, the ball should, this is like another core animation thing, right? Stretching and squash. So as the ball hits the ground, it should compress and then stretch as it gets to the top, right? Have that kind of snappiness to it, that reaction. So we're going to do something very similar to what we just did, but in the other parameters, right? We're going to do it in the size X, not just the size X and Y, not just the global offset. So we'll hop back into the graph here, and now we'll hook up the size to animate exactly like our position offset is using. The first thing I want to do actually is I'm going to put this in a frame, not an FX map. That's a different tutorial for sure. We'll put this in a frame, and I'm going to pick my favorite color, just about. And I'm just going to label this animator. And this is just so that we're always able to tell at a glance in this graph where the animation is happening, where the important stuff is, right? It's just a visual aid. Keeping your graphs organized is a real help for keeping yourself like not lost. So we're going to do the same thing we were doing to the offsets to the size. Now I've talked about this in the tile generator know the node video. I don't like this interstice mode. I think this makes your life more complicated, especially when I'm doing animation stuff like this. So I just switched to size. right? That just gives us two numbers, the horizontal size and the vertical size, because we want this kind of stretch and squash behavior now. So it's almost like, now a hard ball does this a little bit, right? Like depending on, a basketball will do it a little bit, a soccer ball would probably do it more. Different balls will do this differently, but we want to exaggerate it. Think of it like a water balloon, right? Stretch and squashing is another like core, animation principle. But the idea is that if you drop that water balloon, when it hits the ground, it shrinks right on impact vertically. But not only does it shrink vertically, it expands horizontally, right? Because it's not like the ball shrinks on impact and some of it just goes into a different dimension. It has to go somewhere. So that volume in the water balloon spreads out like a pancake, right? And the same thing happens at the top of the motion. The balloon is going to stretch vertically, but shrink horizontally as it turns into kind of a narrow ball and then a flat ball, right? We want that sort of, it's going to add a lot more character to the bounce, but it's also going to add a bit more kind of physics, essentially, right? It's going to feel a bit more realistic. So you can imagine when the ball's on the bottom, we want the vertical number to go down by 0.5, let's say, and the horizontal number to go up by 0.5. So we're not losing any part of the ball, right? We're just changing where it goes. So we need to do a similar setup here. We know that if we look at our global offset, the top value of the lerp is what's happening at the bottom of the motion, and the bottom number is what's happening at the top of the movement. So if we know that, we can go to our size, and we're going to empty this function, create a new graph. We're going to do the same thing. It'd be nice to see it again, right? So we get a time variable, we get our anim speed, and we multiply them together because we want this stretch and squash to have the same speed and phase as the up and down motion as well. We're going to run this time through a sine wave, and we want to return only the positive values. So we use an absolute, just like what we did on the offset. And we're going to plug this into a lerp between our two values. So let's do the vertical number first, right? The vertical size. So we know at the top of the movement, which happens here, this is the top of the movement. And this is the bottom of the movement. So at the bottom of the movement, we want the ball to get 50% smaller. And at the top of the movement, we want it to get 50% bigger. So this is just the vertical number. We'll be making notes for this and noting it up for the eventual Patreon upload. If you want to go look there, I'll label everything here. But for now, just for the speed sake and keeping the video with hopefully under an hour, I'm not going to do that yet. So we have some issues here, right? We're getting this kind of yellow warning sign. And it says Y right here. No output node is defined. We don't have an orange node in here. That's the output. And it's saying, hey, you need a float 2, by the way. Right? So remember, our size is two numbers, an X size and a Y size, right? Horizontal and vertical. So we need to get a vector float 2 so that we can turn or attach two single numbers to make two numbers attached to each other, right? So this is the V value, the Y size, and this is the X size. We're just leaving the X size at 1. We're not touching it yet. We're only changing the vertical size. You can see when we set this as the output node, we see our ball squash. So I'm going to republish that, bring it into player. And sure enough, there we go. Right, so it's getting taller at the top and shrinking at the bottom. So that already feels a lot, it's got more character. I'm not crazy that it's wrapping around. That's just because at the top of the range, it's stretching so tall that it's going over the other side. So we can change that too by just going to this tile generator and setting its tiling to only horizontal tiling. We don't want it to tile vertically. So if you republish this and bring this in, we won't have that behavior anymore. Right? It doesn't loop around, which is nice. But this is really cool. Now we're only moving vertically. right? We're only stretching it up and down. We're not doing that squeeze left and right. So we're going to hop back into our size. And really, the size just needs to be the opposite of this. So we can just copy this, but rearrange the order here. Because at the bottom of the movement, we want it to get 50% smaller in Y, but we want it to get 50% wider in Y and X. And at the top of the movement, we want it to get 50% taller, but we also want it to get 50% shorter or narrower. So this becomes our X value. And this is when stuff starts to feel really a lot more, it's got a lot more character, right? It starts to feel a lot more like an actual bouncing ball. Now, it could be a little too strong, right? Maybe the stretch and squash is a little strong here. So we could make a variable if you wanted to control that, or if you wanted to change it over time. There's a bunch of things you can do. Sort of just limited by your imagination here. So I'm going to make another one, another input rather. And I'm going to call this stretch. And, well, we'll call it, that's the identifier, but we'll call the label, I can't spell. There you go. And we'll set its default value to like 0.5. And then what we can do is just hop into our size graph here. And we just won't have these be hard coded, right? We're going to actually control it with the strength of that size and stretch. Or we're going to control it with the size of the stretch and squash, rather. So we're going to get a float and grab the one we built, that stretch and squash. And what we're going to do here is really one, if we plug a value of 1 into these, let's get these out of the way for a sec, nothing would change, right? Because the size Y is not changing, whether it's at the bottom of the movement or the top of the movement, doesn't change. But what we could do is say, hey, instead of being 1.5 at the bottom and 0.5 at the top, why don't we just add whatever our stretch and squash value is to 1, which right now is 0.5. So it would be this anyway, but it's now changeable, right? And we're going to take that same value and subtract it from 1, which would make it be 0.5, right? Right now, this is no different than had we plugged these in, right? Doesn't look different right now, but we can change this number to be whatever we want. So if we clear these out, and we're going to do the same thing here too, right? If we add the stretch and squash to this, we get 1.5. If we subtract 0.5 from 1, we get 0.5, which is plugged in here. So this just allows us to control this, to have that amount be variable, right? To republish this and open up player again. This doesn't change, but we can change the amount of stretch and squash. If we set it to 0, it just won't at all. Doesn't stretch or squash, whatever. We can make it really strong. I mean, this is crazy, right? But maybe 0.5 is a little too intense. You want something more like 0.2. It's a little bit more subtle. 0.34, whatever. This just allows you to control that a bit more, have a bit more fine tuning over it. And there's a lot more you could do to the stretch and squash here. Like you could have it so that instead of just becoming a ovoid at the bottom, it actually like flattens at the bottom. There's all sorts of things you can do with that. We're just not going to bother with it today, right? We might do that as a bonus on the Patreon maybe. But in this video, it's sort of not important right now. This is a good enough proof. I think at this point, what we want to do is get that horizontal motion going. I think that's probably more valuable. So we're just going to have it bounce back and forth, like just like a springy ball. So this is going to work a little bit differently from the stuff we had been doing. We need to now go and change the position X, not just the position Y. Right, so we don't need our size anymore in here. Right, because right now we're just not moving it in X at all. We're only moving it in Y. So what we'll do here, this is a bit more interesting. This is where we're going to have to use that sine wave where we remap it from -1 to 1 to 0 to 1 to make this feel a bit more reliable. So what we're really going to do is have this X value go from like positive 0.3 to negative 0.3, something like that, right? And just bounce back between those two values, right? So let's set this at 0 right now. We're going to go in here. Let's just set them here. Well, just so we can visualize it, we'll go positive 0.25 and it's not able to delete that properly. And we'll go negative 0.5. So just going to go left and right like this. So we're going to do the same thing here where we can use all of this, but we need a different sine wave. We don't technically, we can use this one too, but you'll see why we're probably going to need it a bit later. So we'll take this, and this is just going to be a lerp between minus 0.3 and positive 0.3, like this. Now, the issue with doing it this way, right? You'd think, okay, there's a bunch of problems with this, and we can see them. If we republish this and open up it in player, we're going to hate this. It doesn't work very well, right? There's a couple things going on here. For one thing, the sine wave is going from +1 to -1, right? Which isn't helpful. That's an example we had down here in the graph, right? Right now, we're doing this. And we instead want it to go from +1 to -1, or from 0 to +1. So we need to do that same thing we demonstrated earlier, where we take this range and we multiply it by half to shrink it down, and then add 0.5 to make it go from -1 to 1 to 0 to 1. So it just cleanly bounces between the two numbers. So you could use that node, right, that we saw, the remapper node, or you can do the math we had done earlier, which is just to take the sine wave, multiply it by half, like this, and then add 0.5 as well. So now the sine wave is at least remapped. If we were to republish this, you'll see that this is actually an improvement for sure. But it's still not great. So we just make sure we refresh this and hit play. So it's interesting. It's not great though. The reason for this is kind of interesting. What's happening here is basically, if you think about the sine wave going from 0 to 1, let's say, in the height, that makes, if we go from 0 to 1, we're just going from the bottom to the top. And then we have to go back to 0 in order to return it to the ground. We want that ball to go like this, right? It needs to complete half as much of its movement by the time it hits the ground, essentially, right? So the vertical movement goes 1, 2, it's hit the ground. But right now, the horizontal movement is going 1, 2, so it's returning to its original spot when it hits the ground again. That's why it's just going diagonally like this. So what we need to have happen here is the vertical sine wave needs to move. It needs two of them two vertical movements need to happen for every horizontal movement, right? So we actually need the horizontal sine wave to be moving faster. So it'll essentially look like this when they overlap. This is the vertical movement of the ball. And this is what the horizontal movement of the ball will look like. Just so you can visualize it. We need this wave to actually happen twice. So this is not making it work or anything. This is just me showing you how to visualize it. It'll look like this. This is the vertical movement of the ball. Let's get like something like here going. So the red, or let's make this one green. This is the vertical movement of the ball. And this is the horizontal movement of the ball, which will be red. It's the UV coordinates. Like this. Right? So the ball is going to go, put this right here for a sec. This is a way of visualizing it, right? The ball is going to go up and down, but it's going left and right twice as much, or half as much, really. Right? So really it should be the reverse here. We'll do it like this. Right? So every time this goes up and down, it's going to make a transition from left to right. Right? So it goes up, down, up, down, in the time it takes to go from left to right, not to go from left to right to left. Right? So you'll see here, we'll put this down here for an example. All we really have to do is go to the global offset, and we need this sine wave to move half as much. So we'll just take this time coming out of here and multiply it by 0.5 before it goes off to the horizontal movement. Like that. So here's our vertical movement stuff. Here's our horizontal movement stuff. And we'll export that. And we'll hop back into player here and just make sure we're refreshed. And if we hit play, now we have that ball bouncing twice as much up and down as it is moving left to right. So we get these two bounces and it actually hits the ground in the right spots. And this is really cool, right? So here we have a simple bouncing ball animation. Like I mentioned, you're limited by your imagination here, right? You could do all sorts of different stuff with this. You could have a bunch of different balls bouncing around that all have like random positions on them. So it's possible we do something like that on the Patreon as well, right? So the balls have like different starting positions and different heights they bounce to and different speeds. So we'll add that to the Patreon video if you want to go look at that. But this is just a basic setup here. Next, I'd like to do some stuff with rotations, right? Because we haven't done anything with that. We've done translation and scale, but nothing with rotation. So let's make a different graph for that. I'm going to make, why don't we make a clock? That could be fun. So we'll call this the clock graph. And we're going to start with a splatter circular here. And we're going to make like a working clock that is sped up essentially. So we'll go make an output here. Splatter circular is just like a tile generator, but it works in a ring, which is kind of neat. What I'm going to do is make an arrow here. So let's get a polygon and we'll make this have 3 sides. And I'm just going to move these into place. I like using a tile generator to move stuff like this. You'll see me do this a lot when I'm making patterns. Make an image input, scale it down. I might need to move it down X a little. that. And then I'm going to take this shape. Speaking of shapes, I'll shrink this down a bit. And I'm going to blend this in. And we're basically going to make an hour and second hand and have it like, we can have it actually tell time if we want, which will be cool. So this arrow, the arrowhead is a little too tall. So we'll scroll this down. And you can make this obviously a way more, fancy clock if you'd like. That's extremely doable. So here's our hour hand. Hate interstice mode. We change it every time. There you go. And we want to do the same thing we were doing in the other tutorial, where we want the pivot point to be the center of this. So I can take a tile generator again, make it 1 by 1, use the image input, and I'm going to scale this down by 0.5 and offset it by 0.5 as well. Or negative 0.5 or positive 0.75, same thing. I just want this to pivot from the center. Right? So we have our hour hand here. Or we'll do the minute hand first, I guess. So we're going to take this. I also want to rotate it 90 degrees. I want it to start at the straight up position. And on the splatter circular, we're just going to go, give me an image input, and I just want one of these. I'm going to put the radius to 0, so it's right in the middle, and scale them up a bunch. The minute hand is bigger. You're all familiar with clocks. I don't need to tell you. So we do this, and I want to rotate this, like pre-rotate it so it starts up. And we just want this clock to rotate around. And we have that on the splatter circular generator. All we need to do is look at the rotation rollout. So it'll be in rotation here. What you're looking for is ring rotation. So it's this number, right? So we need a variable for here too. We'll call this like speed multiply. We'll just call it speed actually. Like this. So we're going to go into the splatter circular grayscale and go to the rotation, ring rotation, and empty the function. And we'll just get a float, set it to time, multiply it by that variable we built, right? That speed variable. Just so we can change the speed if we want. And because this value, that time value just increases, the clock is just going to spin. And that's sort of it. So, oops. We're going to save this. We'll call this intro to anim clock. And I'm going to publish this as a substance archive. Right? We'll call it here. And let's pull it into player. And now we have the minute hand zipping around. And we know, right, this hour hand, if we're going to make it, should move at what, 1/12 of the speed? Or sorry, for every 60 times this goes around, the hour clock should move 1 of 12, right? So we can do the math to actually have the hour hand move the exact amount as the rest. So hopping back into the main graph, we're going to make an hour hand, which I'll just duplicate the splatter circular, and we're going to shrink it down. I'm also going to make it darker just so that we can blend it with our minute hand here. And all we need to do, right, the hour hand is sort of going to set the pace, right? So it'll move whatever the clock speed is. So if we go down to our rotation random, we don't really need to change anything. But for every time that the hour hand makes one full rotation, the minute hand needs to make 60 of them, right? For each of the 60 minutes in an hour. So all we have to do is go to the minute hand ring rotation and multiply its speed by 60. So it will do 60 entire rotations in the time it takes the hour to do one rotation. We can even make a second hand if we want to. So we'll grab a splatter circular as well, but this time we'll make the minute hand. I think I'm just remembering this from being a kid, I guess. I just want this to be a block. Like it won't have like a arrow on it. I think I'm just remembering like school clocks here. So I'm just gonna take this and make this be our second hand. Take this. I'm just giving it the right around a 90-degree rotation so it's faced up. And we'll shrink this down a bunch in X and Y. So this is just going to be like a little arrow. So tiny, tiny little arrow. And let's make the second hand actually be like, oh, you just lay it on, that's fine. Right, and this needs to move 60 times for every time the minute hand moves. So we actually have to take 60 and multiply it by 60. So it needs to move 3,600 times for every time the hour hand moves, right? The 3,600 seconds in an hour. So we just go down to our ring rotation and set this to 3,600. So there's our second hand. Now this is going to be ridiculously fast because we've sped up time a ton. So we'll have to slow it down a bunch. But let's just see how this looks. It's going to be a madhouse. It's going real quick, but I also didn't blend everything over. So we need to set our max light in here and our max so we can see all the hands. We'll republish this, open up player, and this should be totally bonkers. But it is working. So we just need to slow this down a bunch if we want it to appear anywhere even reasonable. So put it at like 5%. Right, so it is working. It's just, we're going to need to have this number be really, really small if we want it. And you could actually do the math to have this like legitimately tell time. But that's a bit more reasonable. Right? So you have the minute hand move, second hand move, hour hand move, which is pretty cool. If we set it up again, we can see it really going. But there's no reason why you couldn't create like a totally functional clock here. Right? And you could make this a bit nicer. You'd put it inside an actual like proper clock face, and you could have this really work if you wanted to. And like I said, you can do the math to have this actually tell time, which is cool. This is really fast. But it's neat, and I definitely wanted to have an example of rotation going on in here. Just because it does work slightly differently, then we're not really working with a sine wave. You'd also add a pendulum to the clock. If you wanted this to swing in back, I think it swings with the minute or the second hand. So pendulum would be going really quick right now, right? I think on a clock, the pendulum is the seconds, I assume. But this is very cool. Rotation's neat. You can do all sorts of fun stuff with this as well. I think the last thing I wanted to show here was a bit of a more unorthodox approach. Like you don't necessarily have to just, all we've been really doing both with the bouncing ball and the clock hand is driving kind of shapes around. But I want to stress, like I did in the intro, that you're like totally limited here only by your imagination. Like you can make this as crazy as you want. And so something maybe a bit more useful, let's make another graph. Intro to anim, windy grass. Let's actually make a grass field that actually blows in the wind. That could be kind of cool. So I'm going to make a tile sampler. We're going to have a video all about this coming soon. I think on the Patreon, people we're having a vote coming up on what should come up next, and this is one of them. So I think it'll come up pretty quick depending on what people want. But this is just a tile generator, but you can control a bunch of the different parameters with textures as opposed to just values like you can on a tile generator. So I'm going to make a really simple grass blade. So we'll take a parabola, shrink it down a bit, make a histogram scan. This. And in fact, we'll shrink that a little bit less. And I'm going to lay a gradient over this because we're going to want to do a bunch of blending. So we'll do min darken. This will be okay. So here's our grass blade. Again, just like we've been doing on everything else, we really want this to rotate from the bottom of the blade. So I'm going to make a tile generator grayscale. Set it to 1 by 1 and scale this down until we have the center of the texture aligned with the bottom of the grass blade. So what I like to do here is just use a transform to guide myself because I need that circle to be the bottom. And so I need to go up a bit more. Yeah, that's perfect, basically. So we're going to just scatter this around like crazy. We probably need a bunch of them. We're definitely going to need a ton of them. So let's get crazy. Let's add like 64 by 64. And we'll scale them up a bunch. And we're going to obviously want to add a bunch of like random position and offset, all that fun stuff. We can even change the color random so we have them all slightly different heights. But what we're going to do is move the rotation of these based on an input texture, right? So they're going to get their rotation information coming from a noise. So what we're really going to do here is use a vector rotation map. We'll have a whole, excuse me, we'll have a whole video about these at some point, no doubt. But what this basically does is, let's take like a uniform color, for example, and we'll make should be a merge. We're going to put 0.5 into both red and green and plug that into vector map input. And you'll see if we go down to rotation and turn on our vector map multiplier, it's rotating them all they're moving up to the top right corner, right? And the different values you have in this vector field will change where these rotate left and right, right? So we can use this to our advantage here. We could even just do it with a rotation map if we wanted to and ignore the vector if it's easier to see. We could try this. We'll turn the vector map multiplier off for a sec and use the rotation map. The issue with the rotation map is that we're only ever rotating it to the right, where a vector map can do both. So what you're often doing is just turning this into a normal map. So it's -1. We'll make the normal map strength quite high. And we'll do it as vector map rotation instead of rotation map. So we'll go down to rotation, turn the rotation map down, turn the vector map up. And this is really cool because we get them rotating different directions based on this texture. And you can imagine that if we move this texture, we essentially have wind. Right? As these rotate. Another thing you can do is instead of moving it, just change the disorder of this texture. We have this kind of wind passing through the blades, which is really neat. And this can be, blurry, or it can be whatever you want. You can change this noise. It doesn't have to be this Gaussian noise. It's just the one I chose. But it can be way blurrier. The other thing you could do is warp this a little bit by this as well. Afterwards. And imagine if we're able to just have this number constantly change. We essentially have like a wind passing through here, which is pretty cool. And this is very animatable. So all we really need to do is, again, we're going to make a parameter called wind speed. And we're just going to go to our disorder on this noise. We're going to create an empty function, get a float. We want time, but we're going to multiply it by that wind speed. Like this. Or we grabbed the wrong node there. I grabbed non-square expansion by accident. So let's actually put this in disorder and make that the output. And then I'll just reset non-square expansion. I just grabbed the wrong one. And we'll plug this into the output. And what we'll actually do here is, why don't we just actually make this? Because it's not just we've been doing masks up until now, but you could make this be an actual full material if you'd like. So we'll add like some normal, turn the roughness way up, and we'll do like a quick gradient map just to get the color. And we'll just pick a gradient map where the black is sort of like a more blue, dark green. And the white tips are a bit more of a bright green, a bit more yellow, a bit less saturated. So we can actually just do the whole texture potentially. I'm going to scale this texture out a little bit, so it's not as nuts. And let's just put this out again. We're going to open up our intro to Anima. And we have multiple graphs in here, right? We have the ball generator. We also have the windy grass. This is really great. So we just have this cool like wind effect now going through this texture. And we can slow the wind down, like it's a little intense, right? So we'll go to the windy grass and turn that down quite a bit. And that's kind of neat. And we have a 3D view in here as well. So you can put this on a sphere and just make sure that in the graphs down here, you're picking the windy grass. And we should be able to just actually see this working. Pretty low resolution, right? We could change the resolution of this grass up to 1K. Now it's going to be, you can start to see that it's getting slower, right? Because we're doing more stuff now. Generally speaking, right? The further back in the graph the time variables are happening, the slower it's going to be. Because every time anything updates here on this exposed time disorder, all of this stuff needs to change. And that's where the slowdown comes from, right? So if you're able to put the speeds at the end of the graph, that's a lot more helpful if you can, right? Sometimes you can't, like we can't here. There's probably some ways we could make this a bit faster, but that is the limitation of it, right? As we were mentioning in the intro, it is just not runtime. So you just have to be careful. But this is really cool, right? You can make a lot of really fun stuff with this, and this is just to get people's kind of imaginations going. Any parameters in here of any kind are accessible in this way. We could change the amount of grass blades. We can change how big they get. There's just a lot of stuff you can do here to make this a lot more interesting. Like I do think, for example, bending the blades a little here would help. So we really need like a vector morph here and plug the same normal map in. And we'll make this a little less intense. We'll do these instead. This will help the blades feel a little bit more natural. They'll have a bit more of a bend to them. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with this. I just wanted to give this relatively brief intro, right? I mean, I want it to be under an hour, but I don't think we are, if I had to guess. Let me turn the speed down. But I'm hoping this gives people the idea of how this stuff works. We will no doubt make more in the future. But I think these 3 should be a really good jump off point for people that are interested in it. Okay, so that's that for today. I wanted to keep this under an hour, but I don't think it was possible. I hope everyone found that helpful and found at least something useful or fun in there. Like I mentioned in the intro, this stuff isn't terribly useful from a runtime perspective, right? But there's still a lot of cool stuff you can do. If you're doing offline rendering or whatever, or you're doing motion graphic stuff and you want to make some stuff that you put into After Effects or whatever in your projects, this will help a lot, right? There's a lot of cool stuff you can do. I've done a lot of motion graphic stuff in here. If you found this helpful and you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate the subscribe. I was looking at the analytics the other day, and it's something like 3 or 4% of people who watch the videos are subscribed. So I'd appreciate the subscribe. That really helps. If you would like, or like the video as well. If you would like to like the video, that is also great. If you want to get the part of the video where we're going to go and put this stuff into Unreal and plug it into a shader, you can go, that'll be up on Patreon. As well, you'll be able to, on Patreon, download the graphs I built here with all the notes. I'd said I'll organize it and put all the notes on it and comment stuff if people want to go through and play with the sine wave example and all that stuff. That's up on the Patreon. I appreciate the support if you're able to do so. It's one of the things that really helps me able to continue making content, be able to dedicate time to just making more stuff like this. This video was the result of people voting on seeing animated stuff. So if you would like to have a voice in the way the channel is directed and what stuff comes next, there's going to be a vote coming up soon on the next kind of batch of stuff. I'd appreciate if you head over there and support. If not, hit the like button, subscribe, turn on the notification bell. I greatly appreciate it. That stuff all helps a lot. And we'll see you guys in the next one.